The class was told to show a dangerous game. The human gathered everyone to play Russian roulette. The lower staging platform vibrated with the rhythmic hiss of pressurized coolant and the sharp scent of ionized metal. The air smelled of recycled nitrogen and the gray salt of the training slabs. Daniel Knox sat on the low iron bench, his heels hard against the stone, his breath a flat and quiet line in the dark. Beside him, 3 alien recruits adjusted the heavy dials on their power packs, the casings glowing with a cold blue fire that threw long lines across the floor. Knox did not look up. He touched the hasty stitches on his uniform collar with one thick finger, counting the threads by feel. The galaxy had spent 3 millennia perfecting the art of measurable violence, yet it took less than 6 seconds of absolute stillness to make them realize they had never actually encountered danger. Inside the circle of the obsidian tier, a massive warrior from the core world stepped into the light. His torso was a high pile of red chitin that clicked like dry bone whenever he turned his chest. His name was Cadet Jarn, and his lower mandibles twitched with a short, wet sound that passed for a laugh among his kind. He held a high-frequency plasma blade in his upper 3 hands, its edge singing a flat note that turned the air white. The title of the exhibition was simple, posted on every screen across the 4 sectors of the Academy: a display of supreme lethal risk. The rules required each fighter to face an automated turret set to a near-fatal charge, proving their honor by how much heat their skin could take before the medical drones pulled them out. Daniel Knox did not look at the blade. He looked at Jarn's right foot, noting the small shift in weight before the Red Warrior lunged toward the firing line. The automated turret on the high wall dropped its muzzle. A thick beam of white light struck the center of Jarn's chest, turning the red chitin to gray ash in a second. Jarn did not scream. He stepped forward into the blast, his mandibles locking tight as his blood turned to black grease on the stone floor. The diagnostic drones hovered 3 inches from his eyes, their internal lenses turning with a rapid click as they measured his heart rate and the skin loss on his ribs. A thin green field flashed around the warrior, cutting the turret's power before the heat could reach his spine. It was an elite display, a managed piece of death with an antidote waiting in the air. Jarn stepped back from the circle, his chest smoking, his 3 arms lifting the plasma blade to salute the upper tiers where the teachers sat behind thick glass panels. His lower arms rubbed a blue gel over his burned skin, the meat sealing before the black grease could dry. He looked down at Knox, his secondary eyes widening into 2 flat discs. "The Terran brought no shield," Jarn said. His voice came through a brass translator grid on his throat, flat and loud. "He carries no battery on his belt. Perhaps the human representative intends to fight the turret with his teeth." Knox did not look up from his boots. "The teeth are fine," he said. The air inside the tier grew thick as the secondary lines cleared. The Red Warrior walked toward the perimeter, his heavy steps shaking the iron benches where the other species sat. They had spent 40 cycles watching the smaller worlds drop out of the trials, their bodies too soft or their minds too weak to face the measured heat of the core. Commandant Vithal sat in the high box, his massive arms crossed over his chest. His skin was a dark gray stone built from plates of basalt that never showed the pulse underneath. He held an obsidian stylus between 2 thick fingers, his dark eyes fixed on the ledger before him. He did not like the Terran's posture. He did not like the salt lines on Knox's gray fatigues or the dry leather of his boots. "The representative from Earth will enter the demonstration circle," Vithal's voice boomed through the low speakers. The sound was a heavy weight that seemed to press the dust into the floor. Knox stood up. He did not use the handrails. He reached into his deep uniform pocket, his fingers closing around a small, coarse piece of gray cloth. The shape inside was thin and cold, completely lacking the heavy square housing of an energy cell or the brass terminals of a chemical pack. He walked 6 steps into the center of the white light, his boots making a dull thud against the masonry where Jarn's blood had already gone cold. He stood there for 5 seconds without moving. The turret above him did not click. Its tracking eye swung left, then right, its internal logic searching for a shield signature or a power draw to lock its sensors onto. It found nothing but wool and old leather. Knox uncurled the gray cloth. He placed an obsolete piece of 21st century steel on the stone table in front of the command box. It was an archaic mechanism of kinetic percussion, 6 empty chambers waiting for an index. The drones descended in a swarm, their red lights washing over the gray metal. Their screens flashed 3 white lines of error. The apparatus did not possess high-yield energy signatures, yet no drone would risk touching its chassis. "There is no link," the prelate beside Vithal whispered. His fingers flew across the control board trying to find the frequency of the weapon. It has no remote kill switch. It does not connect to the medical grid. Nox looked up at the glass window where Vithal sat. His face was entirely clean of expression, the lines around his eyes deep and gray from months of night shifts on the outer docks. This is an inventory for individuals who have completely run out of intelligent alternatives, Nox said. His voice was not loud, but the silence in the room was so thin that every cadet heard the scrape of his throat. He reached into his pocket again and brought out a single brass cylinder. It was 3 inches long, its base tipped with a small circle of gray lead. The metal looked dirty against the clean white light of the tier. He dropped it into one of the open slots. The heavy cylinder made a short, dry sound as it settled into the steel. Gleg. The red warrior Jarn shifted on his bench, his lower mandibles tightening until they clicked against his chest. A kinetic slug, he muttered through his grid. A child's toy from the swamp worlds. It has no yield. It has enough, Nox said. He did not use his thumb to cock the hammer yet. He simply turned the cylinder with his left index finger, his skin making a dry whisper against the ridges of the steel. The mechanism spun. The tiny metal pins inside the frame struck each slot with a rhythmic rattle that sounded like a dry snake moving through gravel. Click, 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 click. A mechanical rattle against the stone wall did what plasma fields never could. It made them remember their own pulse. I wish I could tell you it ended there. It didn't. Stay close. The transition columns on the back wall shifted their pitch, their hum dropping 3 octaves as the automated turret went into standby mode. The system could not calculate a baseline for a weapon that required a physical finger to compress a spring before the fire could start. 6 weeks before Nox ever stood in the tier, the Central Administrative Archives had been cold. The room was 3 levels below the hangar decks where the smell of oil was weak and the air had the flat taste of old copper. Nox had been working the late log shifts, his fingers moving across the manual slates because the digital transfer pins often failed during the high-gravity turns of the station. He was not a high-ranking cadet. He was a second-class keeper, an old veteran whose joints cracked whenever the weather in the sector dropped below 30 units. An administrative clerk named Hernks had been watching him from the central desk. Hernks had 6 limbs and 2 pairs of tracking eyes that never closed at the same time. He had spent 9 cycles recording the physical dimensions of every species that entered the facility, writing down their muscle mass and the thickness of their skulls to calculate their survival index. The Terran registry is incomplete, Hernks had said that morning. He did not look at Nox. His upper hands were busy cleaning a white ceramic stylus with a small piece of blue leather. Your files do not show a defensive lineage. Your ancestors did not fight in the Core Wars. No, Nox had said. He was scraping the grease from a broken hinge with a flat pocket knife. We fought each other mostly, in the mud. That is non-standard, Hernks said, his secondary eyes turned toward the knife. A war without an umpire is merely slaughter. It has no educational value for the state. Nox had set the knife down on the iron desk. The blade was old steel, its surface showing thin gray lines from too many sharpenings against the river stones of his home world. You don't need an umpire when the ground is cold, he said. The ground doesn't care who wins the point. The memory of that cold room stayed with him as he stood in the white circle of the tier. The cadets around the perimeter had gone still, their heavy armor creaking as they leaned forward to see the small brass round inside the cylinder. They understood plasma, they understood the precise division of heat into units of skin loss. They did not understand a machine that had only 2 settings, 0 or the end. Daniel Nox did not look at their eyes. He kept his gaze fixed on the small notch at the top of the revolver's frame, his hands perfectly steady as he lifted the cold iron muzzle and pressed it hard against his own temple. The skin behind his ear went white under the pressure of the steel barrel. The metal of the muzzle was cold against his temple, a sharp contrast to the humid warmth of the tier. Commandant Vithal leaned over his console, his gray stone chest pressed against the polished rail of the box. His dark eyes did not blink. On his display, the medical drones were spinning in a low, tight circle above Nox's head, their sensors casting pale green lines across his face. The drones were completely silent. Their internal programs were searching for the standard signals of a training exercise, a pulse transmitter, a neural kill switch, or an electronic brake on the kinetic mechanism. The display showed 0. The weapon was a dead block of iron and grease cut off from every network in the building. "He has no secondary field," the prelate whispered at Vithal's shoulder. His fingers were shaking as they tapped the slate. "Sir, if the percussion pin hits the chemical primer, the reaction will complete in less than 3 milliseconds. The drones cannot generate a kinetic block in that window. Their fields require 12 milliseconds to charge from a dead stop." Vithal did not answer. His obsidian stylus remained motionless in his hand. For 40 cycles he had watched every species in the Alliance display their capacity for death. He had seen the green-skinned warriors of the outer arm take 5 plasma bolts to the limbs before dropping. He had seen the chitinous cohorts of the core worlds lose half their carapace to the turrets and continue to strike. But those displays were calculations. The fighters knew the exact yield of the weapons. They knew the precise volume of regenerative fluid waiting in the floor plates. They knew the legal limit of the damage before the match was called. The human was not calculating. He was standing in a small space where the rules had simply ceased to exist. Knox's finger began to pull back the curved trigger. Inside the lock of the revolver, a tiny steel spring compressed, its teeth scraping against the inner wall of the frame with a dry mechanical squeak that carried through the low speakers. Cadet Jarn leaned forward from his bench, his upper hands gripping his knees so hard that his red carapace began to turn a light, dusty gray. He had never seen an unshielded skull exposed to a chemical expansion. His lower mandibles parted, a thin line of blue saliva dropping onto his boot. "The probabilities are 5 in 6, Knox said into the quiet. His eyes did not move from the center wall. 83%, excellent odds for a harvest or a cargo run, a bit narrow for a skull." "Daniel Knox," Vithal's voice broke through the speakers, no longer a boom but a harsh, grating rattle. "The exhibition requires a measurable threshold. This is an administrative evaluation, not a trench." "This is an inventory," Knox corrected him. His voice remained flat, the slow rhythm of his chest unchanging. "And the threshold is right here." The spring inside the lock reached its limit. The steel hammer flew forward, its flat face striking the rear of the empty chamber with a short, sharp crack that had no echo. Click. The sound was tiny, a small drop of iron on stone, yet every alien warrior in the tier flinched as if a shield had ruptured. Jarn's lower arms went wide, his body throwing itself back against the bench until his power pack struck the masonry with a heavy thud. The medical drones dropped 3 inches in a sudden panic, their lights turning red as they tried to record an impact that did not happen. Knox did not lower the weapon. He kept the muzzle pressed against his white skin for 2 seconds, letting them see the small gray ring the iron had left behind his ear. Then, with a slow turn of his wrist, he slid the gray revolver across the polished stone table toward Jarn's side of the perimeter. The weapon slid 6 feet, its steel butt scraping a white line into the dark floor before it stopped 2 inches from Jarn's closest foot. "Your turn," Knox said. The Red Warrior did not move. He looked down at the iron cylinder, his 3 upper hands frozen around his plasma blade as if the blue light could protect him from the dead metal at his feet. His secondary eyes were wide, the discs spinning rapidly as they tried to find the power cell or the remote receiver on the gun's frame. There were none. The revolver lay there like an old stone from a dead valley, holding 1 live round in an unknown slot, its mechanical pins locked until a finger moved the trigger again. "It has no sensor," Jarn muttered, his translator grid spitting a dry burst of static. "How do I know where the lead is? How do I tell the machine to skip the chamber?" "You don't," Knox said. He walked back to his bench and sat down, his heels thudding against the iron leg just as they had 10 minutes before. "That's the game. You pull and you find out if the ground wants you today." A long murmur passed through the upper tiers, a dry rustle of scales and leather plates as the teachers looked at each other. They were the masters of tactical metrics. They had written the manuals on defensive formation and energy management for 40 worlds. But their screens were useless now. The database had no entry for a soldier who used an obsolete kinetic tool to turn an alliance evaluation into a lottery. Commandant Vithal slowly dropped his stylus onto the ledger. His stone fingers were trembling, a faint gray dust flaking from his knuckles as his internal thermal plate shifted down to absolute cold. The realization struck his staff before it hit the floor. The humans had not survived the outer wars by outthinking the machines or outproducing the factories. They had survived because when the line broke, they were entirely comfortable sitting in the dark with an open trigger and no exit strategy. "The session is suspended," Vithal said. The speakers clicked twice as he cut the power to the turret on the wall. The Terran display is recorded under provisional status, clear the tier. The cadets left the arena in a thick, silent column, none of them looking back at the iron table where the gray revolver remained. Jarn walked with his head low, his red arms crossed tightly over his chest to hide the slight twitch in his lower shoulder plates. He did not speak to the other recruits, he did not apply the blue gel to his burns. 2 hours later, the central data network of the Academy began to experience a strange surge. In the dark archives beneath the hangar decks, the lines of light on the walls were pulsing with a rapid, hot blue. Hernks sat at his long desk, his 6 limbs moving across 4 slates at the same time. His secondary eyes were locked on the terminal screen where a single number was flashing in red text. "The queries are climbing," Hernks said without looking at the door as Knox walked into the room. The human was carrying his gray jacket over his arm, his unpolished boots leaving 2 thin lines of dust on the iron floor. 400% in 2 hours. Every tactical center in the sector is downloading the pre-unification logs from Earth. They are looking for the formula for the mechanical spin. "They won't find one," Knox said. He reached down to the desk and picked up his small textile wrap, folding it into his deep pocket. "It's just grease and a spring." "They do not believe that," Hernks said. His upper hands dropped his white stylus, his limbs going loose as he leaned his torso toward the human. "Commandant Vithal has locked the device inside the vault on the 3rd tier. The biometric seals are set to the same frequency they use for unstable prototype munitions. He thinks it is a psychic anchor." Knox let out a short, dry sound that might have been a chuckle. "It's a 6-shot cylinder, Hernks. The only thing it anchors is the guy holding it." "No," the clerk said, his secondary eyes closing until they were nothing but thin slits in his gray skin. "You changed the index. The cadets are not studying the weapon, they are studying their own pulse. They are asking how many chambers are empty in their own ships." Before Knox could answer, a loud red light flashed across the ceiling of the archive. The iron walls groaned as the central transport shaft 3 levels above them gave a sharp, metallic screech. The station's internal gravity field flickered once, dropping Knox 2 inches into his boots before the secondary generators could catch the load. Through the communication grid on Hernks's desk, Vithal's voice came through, cut by the screech of tearing steel. "All units to the docking arm. A structural collision has locked the transport shuttle inside the primary cradle. The seal is breaking." Hernks looked at the slate, his limbs freezing as the data lines went gray. "The cradle has no digital override," he whispered. "The manual controls are behind the bulkhead and the heat signature is already past the survival limit of our armor." Knox did not look at the slate. He pulled his gray jacket back over his shoulders, his fingers tightening around the wrist-stitched collar of his uniform. "Then we don't need the armor," he said. The iron floor plates did not just hum, they bucked, throwing a cloud of gray grit from the masonry seams as the docking arm cracked. Daniel Knox did not run. He walked with a heavy, deliberate stride through the lower secondary junction, his unpolished drill boots finding traction where the green fluid from a ruptured line made the iron slick. Behind him, the administrative clerk Hernks scrambled on 5 limbs, his secondary eyes twitching in 4 different directions as the crimson warning lights painted his gray torso. The air was already thin, tasting of burnt copper and the sharp, sour sting of hot insulation. "The safety fields have dropped to maintenance mode," Hernks gasped, his translator grid throwing a sharp line of static across the corridor. "The automated system cannot verify the pressure lock. The computer is waiting for an engineer with a certified remote code." "The computer's going to be waiting a long time," Knox said. He did not turn his head. "The engineer took the last pod 20 seconds ago." They reached the high threshold of the 3rd cradle. Through the reinforced viewport, the main transport shuttle looked like a broken tooth wedged in the station's jaw. The hull had sheared along the cargo seam, its thick alloy plates grinding against the station's docking ring with a raw, screeching roar that shook the marrow in Knox's shins. Inside the shuttle's cockpit, 3 alien recruits from the outer sectors were slamming their fists against the glass, their scaling crests bright with the defensive electricity of their kind. They had no tools, they had no emergency knives. They had spent their entire lives relying on the automated dampeners to catch a drift, and now that the grid was dark, they were just meat inside a heating tin. A thick column of white smoke poured from the shuttle's ventral vent, smelling of hot lithium and the greasy stink of melting seals. The temperature gauge above the door was already climbing past 90 units. The structural crossbeams are about to buckle, Hernk said, his lower limbs locking around an iron pipe to stay upright as another tremor hit. If the cradle collapses before the manual pins are drawn, the pressure drop will pull the entire lower tier into the void. We must wait for the command team to establish a secondary containment field from the high tier. Vithal's team is 2 miles away behind 3 locked blast doors, Knox said. He reached into his deep uniform pocket and pulled out a heavy, blunt iron wrench. It was an old piece of dock gear, its handle wrapped in dirty black tape that had gone gray from his palm sweat. By the time they find the right frequency, those boys will be charcoal and will be breathing vacuum. He stepped toward the manual release valve. The iron housing was covered in a thick layer of automated foam that had hardened into a crust under the heat. The metal underneath was glowing a dull, angry orange. Cadet Jarn was already there, leaning against the bulkheads with his 3 upper arms holding his burned ribs. His red chitin was cracked from the arena trial, his lower mandibles dry and silent. He looked at Knox's wrench, then at the orange iron of the valve housing. "The thermal conduct is too high," Jarn muttered through his cracked translator. "Your skin will turn to ash before the threads turn twice. My people have double the heat tolerance of a human and I cannot hold the shaft for more than 4 seconds. "That's because you're trying to hold it with your hands," Knox said. He did not look at the Red Warrior. He pulled the coarse gray cloth from his pocket, the same textile he had used to wrap the obsolete revolver, and wrapped it 3 times around the iron handle of his wrench. He did not look at the smoke. He did not check his pulse. He simply hooked the iron teeth of the tool into the notch of the hot release valve, set his dusty boots against the wall, and threw his entire weight against the lever. The skin on his forearms blistered instantly as the ambient heat rolled off the casing, the smell of singed hair rising between them. But his fingers did not slip from the wrapped cloth. The old threads of the rag held. With a loud, wet groan of old grease, the manual pin shifted 2 inches into the socket. Thunk! The white smoke from the ventral vent snapped shut. The screeching of the hull stopped as the docking ring dropped 6 inches, clearing the shuttle's cargo seam and letting the transport vessel slide cleanly into the emergency pocket. The 3 recruits inside the glass dropped to their knees, their scaling crests fading back to a dull, safe gray as the station's internal pressure stabilized. Jarn watched the human drop the wrench. The tool hit the floor plates with a dull clang, the gray cloth still smoking where Knox's palms had pressed it into the orange iron. The Red Warrior's secondary eyes were frozen on Knox's hands, which were red and peeling but entirely steady. "You had no baseline," Jarn said, his voice dropping below the static of his grid. "The valve could have ruptured, the pressure could have cut you in half before the pin cleared the seat. There was no metric for that turn." "There was a wrench," Knox said, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "And there was a rag. That's enough metrics for 1 day." By the time Commandant Vithal arrived with the elite security cohort, the junction was quiet. The automated drones had finally reset, their green lights casting long, regular grids across the wet floor plates as they began the tedious work of cataloging the structural damage. Vithal walked through the smoke, his massive basalt torso unmoving, his dark eyes tracking the white scrape line Knox's wrench had left on the valve housing. He looked at Knox, who was sitting on an empty crate using a small piece of grease paper to scrape the dried salt from his boot heel. The action was slow, ordinary, and completely unbothered by the command staff standing 3 feet away. "The registry shows the Terran representative used an uncertified tool to clear a state cradle," Vithal said. His stone voice was low, carrying a deep tremor that didn't come from the speakers. "The protocol required a secondary lock before the manual pin was touched." "The protocol would have buried 3 of your boys," Knox said without looking up from his boot. He turned the grease paper over, checking the edge. "You can write the ticket if you want, Commandant. My serial number is on the collar." Vithal did not reach for his ledger. He did not look at his staff. He looked down at the floor where the smoking piece of gray cloth lay near the wrench. His stone fingers tightened around his obsidian stylus until the tip left a dark smudge on his palm. "The database has updated the human tactical profile," Vithal said, his voice dropping into a register that made the prelate beside him step back. "It is no longer listed under competitive variables. The strategic board has moved your species to a unique index." He stopped. He turned his torso toward the central administrative lift, his heavy steps slower than they had been in the morning. "They are calling it the recoil factor. a condition where the threshold of risk is determined entirely by the individual's willingness to cease calculating. Knox watched the lift doors close behind the commandant. He threw the dirty grease paper into the dark corner of the junction, his scarred fingers resting on his knee. "They still don't get it," Knox muttered to Hernks, who was still recording the telemetry from the shuttle. "Get what?" the clerk asked, his lower eyes turning toward the human. "It's not an index," Knox said, standing up and checking the gray horizon through the sheared viewport. "It's just what happens when you don't have anywhere else to go." But deep inside the central vault of the third tier, where the biometric seals were supposed to hold the obsolete revolver in total isolation, a quiet line of red text appeared on the master monitor. The automated security grid had recorded a change in the weapon's internal alignment, a tiny half-millimeter shift in the cylinder pin that didn't match any known electronic command. The closed chamber remained a closed loop, but the weight inside it was shifting. The next morning, the central administrative corridors were quiet, but the blue light tubes along the ceiling were pulsing at a reduced frequency. The administrative prelate stood inside the private vault room, his stone fingers tapping a flat slate against the biometric lock of the primary ordnance chest. The chest was built from 5 layers of reinforced slate, designed to hold core munitions that could dissolve a frigate's bulkhead. Inside the chest sat a small piece of 21st-century steel, its unornamented barrel dark under the vault's cold neon tube. Commandant Vithal entered the chamber, his heavy basalt plates scraping against the iron frame of the door. He did not check the tactical slates on the wall. He did not look at the daily registry. He walked directly to the open ordnance chest and stopped, his dark eyes fixed on the archaic mechanical cylinder. The security monitor above the frame showed a tiny red line of variation, the half-millimeter shift in the rotation pins that the automated grid had recorded during the docking rescue. "The tracking system cannot classify the movement," the prelate said, his voice dropping into a dry whisper. "The mechanism has no electric drive, no remote pulse reached the vault, yet the chamber moved." "The chamber did not move because of a pulse," Vithal said. He reached down, his gray hand hovering 2 inches above the steel butt of the revolver before he let it drop back to his side. "The chamber moved because someone changed the parameters of the house." Outside, in the main yard of the Obsidian Tier, 40 civilizations were waiting for the secondary evaluation shift to begin. They did not carry their ceremonial blades. They did not test the charge on their plasma cells. A single name had spread through the lower barracks during the night cycle, not a name of a victory or a lineage, but a ledger code: Daniel Knox. Cadet Jarn sat on the low iron bench near the center ring, his 4 red arms folded tightly over his burned carapace. He was not looking at the automated turret on the wall. He was looking at his own palm, where the gray salt of the training slab had left a dry, white stain. Beside him, 3 other recruits from the outer arm were sitting in the same absolute stillness, their scaling crests dark and flat against their necks. "There is no medical counter for a lead slug," Jarn said, his translator grid giving a low rattle as he spoke to the empty floor. "The database has no entry for the reconstruction of a core when the primer is cold. The human didn't beat the machine, he just didn't care about the script." Knox walked into the yard 3 minutes later. He was carrying a standard water flask made of gray tin, his fingers tracing the dented edge of the cap as he screwed it down. He did not look at the upper boxes. He did not salute the command glass. He took his place on the bench, his unpolished drill boots squeaking against the stone floor until he set his heels flat against the masonry. The pre-twist mundane beat was small. Knox reached into his pocket, pulled out a small gray pencil and sharpened the tip with the flat edge of his pocketknife, letting the graphite shavings fall into the dust between his boots. Vithal stepped out of the central lift, his massive torso unmoving as he entered the demonstration circle. He held the obsolete revolver in his left hand, the steel looking tiny and dark against his gray stone fingers. He did not place it on the table. He did not look at the automated sensors hovering above his head. "The administrative board has completed the review of the Terran entry," Vithal's voice boomed through the yard, but the tone had no resonance. It was a flat, dry scrape that didn't rise past the lower tiers. "The exhibition is closed. The weapon is removed from the Alliance curriculum." He paused, his eyes settling on Knox's face. The human was still looking down at his pencil, his fingers steady on the graphite. "The tactical index has been modified," Vithal continued, his stone hand lifting the iron muzzle until it pointed toward the high vault tiers. "We have spent 3 millennia measuring risk by the thickness of our armor and the yield of our fields. We believed that danger was a calculation that could be managed by an elite facility. He turned the weapon over, his thumb touching the mechanical cylinder until the steel pins gave a short, dry rattle. Click. We were wrong, Vithal said. The human did not bring a tool to the tier, he brought a choice. He showed us that when you remove the grid and the antidote, the bravest martial cultures in the galaxy cannot find their own pulse. He walked toward the exit shaft, his heavy steps slower than they had been during the morning evaluation. He did not return the revolver to the ordnance chest. He kept it in his gray palm, his fingers locked around the cold iron handle as if the dead steel could hold the station's floor plates together. In the dark archive below the hangar decks, Hernk sat at his long desk, his 6 limbs frozen over the terminal slates. The crimson lights on the ceiling had gone out, replaced by the flat white glow of the standard utility lines. But on the main display, the queries were no longer climbing by percentages. The number had reached its limit, the screen showing a single, solid block of red text that filled the entire registry from the core to the outer border. It is not a unique index, Hernks whispered to the empty room, his secondary eyes closing until they were nothing but thin gray lines in his skin. They are not trying to learn the game, they are trying to find out how many chambers are empty in their own sectors. Daniel Knox left the yard before the secondary lines cleared. He walked alone through the lower junction, his gray jacket hooked over his shoulder by one finger, his boots leaving 2 thin lines of dust on the iron floor where the green fluid from the docking rescue had already turned to dry grease. He did not look back at the high tier. He did not check his serialized collar. Inside the private vault room, the master monitor remained dark, its circuits cut off from the main network by Vithal's personal command. But on the floor plates beneath the empty ordnance chest, a small piece of gray rag lay in the corner, its threads still holding the scent of singed hair and cold iron. The closed chamber remained a closed loop, its silence heavier than the vacuum of space.